Hello, welcome to Epicenter Bitcoin, the show which talks about the technologies, projects, and startups driving decentralization and the global cryptocurrency revolution. My name is Sébastien Couture.
And my name is Brian Fabian Crane. We're here today with two old guests and old friends of ours. So Sean, of course, everybody knows from all the episodes and wonderful interviews she's done for Epicenter Bitcoin. And one of those interviews actually was with Preston, who's our guest today. Preston was a lawyer once upon a time, and now he has fully subscribed to the gospel of blockchain, not Bitcoin though, and has started his own startup, which is a very interesting project. Also quite an unusual project, I think. So we'll have a great chance today to talk about that. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, as always.
Hi, guys.
So to get started off, Sean, you had some announcements to make.
Oh, yes. Well, I've just opened my office in the Isle of Man, so now I've got two offices, one in the UK, one on the Isle of Man, and later on this year we'll be opening up in a couple of other offshore jurisdictions. And I'm also spending more and more time in Brussels, where I've co-founded the European Digital Currency and Blockchain Technologies Forum, which is a public policy platform focused heavily on the European institutions, on the Parliament, the Commission, and all the other European institutions to help them be better informed about all this crypto stuff. And that's what I'm doing.
Cool. Awesome. Congratulations. So you're not based in the Isle of Man now, are you? You're still.
I'm spending more and more time there. I'm sort of divided now. I'm there quite a a month, and who knows? You know, I'm going to retire soon, so maybe I'll end up herding sheep or something.
Yes, decentralized sheep.
Yes. I mean, if you're in the Isle of Man, you'd probably be more likely to be like managing PokerStar servers than herding sheep, right?
Oh no! I think I'm going for a quieter life, not nearly so exciting a life. My CIO days are well gone behind me now.
So Sean, I also take it that means you're going to save us from all those evil regulations coming, like European bit license or the VAT and those things with the new Brussels initiative, no?
Well, the European legislators and policymakers are being very pragmatic at the moment, but they are hungry to understand what Bitcoin and digital currencies and indeed the blockchain is all about. But they certainly at the moment are very much more measured in their approach than, say, their colleagues in New York, who've got a very different approach, about which there'll be some new news quite soon. But the bit license proposals version 2 are going to come out soon. But now in Europe, things are much more relaxed. The Isle of Man is a wonderful jurisdiction, a very friendly jurisdiction for virtual currencies, very welcoming, and very easy to do business in. So they'd like to do on the Isle of Man for virtual currencies what they have done in the past for free gaming. So your reference to PokerStars wasn't so far off. In fact, when PokerStars, I think, started on the Isle of Man about 10 years ago, I think there were 3 or 4 people, and now they employ over 200 people, and I did read somewhere that they account for about 4% of the island's GDP now. So they hope to repeat that with digital currencies.
Yeah, that is impressive. So, Preston, tell us.
Why am I here?
Tell us, how did you decide to leave job, your well-paid and well-officed job as a lawyer?
my sexy job as a securitization lawyer,
yes.
waiting piles of documents. Well, it all started last year, actually, at Bitcoin 2014. Sean was there when it all began, because a self-described Bitcoin millionaire was very annoyed with the Bitcoin Foundation. And he said he was going to issue a 100,000 pound bounty in Bitcoin to the team or group of individuals who could design a piece of software that could replace the Bitcoin Foundation and also promote development of the core protocol. So a bunch of the sort of Ethereum community enthusiasts gathered up in a Skype group, and it's like, wow, 100 grand, very money, wow. And so
that's 2 hours of your time as a lawyer, isn't it?
Yes. Well, the problem is I used to do all that stuff for free, which was not very remunerative, but understandably. So we got together, and three of us, a chap who then went by the name Dennis McKinnon, Casey Kuhlman, who's currently our CEO, and myself, started batting some ideas around in a Google Doc. And then it occurred to us we could actually do it, the three of us with our respective skill sets. So we didn't sleep for a month, and we worked and worked and worked, and then eventually we came up with a prototype, Eris 0.1, which was built on Ethereum and designed to replicate the functions of a trade association on a blockchain. And what it could do is some pretty interesting stuff. It had a series of smart contracts, about 30 or 40 of them, which governed how users were able to interact with the various databases they represented. Those smart contracts could be changed over time because of a kernel, which held the logic which allowed you to update the entire system. So the first contract on the sort of cascading branch of contracts going all the way down enabled you to make a state change in any of the subcontracts. And then it occurred to us that you could actually do that with a blockchain. And that's really where Eris started, this idea that if you take all of your blockchain logic, you remove it from being hard-coded in the blockchain, and you put it into a script in the Genesis block, you can have a blockchain which acts a lot more like a regular piece of software in a regular database than it does like Bitcoin. And so that's how all that got started. 3 days after we wrote our white paper, a very nice guy named Sean Park, who also happens to be a VC, sent us an email and said, I'd like to meet you guys. And we started a relationship with that firm then, Anthemis Group, and we've had one with them ever since. And so, and the company's on the move and growing, and building cool shit. So that's how it started. It was a total accident. My law firm was very good about it. Actually, they represented us on the deal. So big thanks to Norton Rose Fulbright in London for that. And I mean, I cannot imagine many law firms being that charitable to a junior associate. Hey guys, I'd like to quit my job. Can you keep me employed while I set about the business of quitting? And which is exactly what they did. So, but yeah, and that's how it all started. And since then we've been.
Credit to you and the other two for having. Unfortunately, you didn't win this prize, but it was so impressive that a second prize was created specifically to reward you guys for the fantastic offer, fantastic proposal that you came up with. So, and
we were really grateful for that. That merits saying. We were very grateful for that. That was very helpful to us. So yeah, and that's how it all started. So
where are you guys based?
We're notionally based in London, although it's in typical fashion, it's distributed. We've got two guys in Guelph, Ontario, which seems to be a sort of hotbed of smart contract activity. A lot of Ethereum people come from there, and one guy in Sweden, in a farm about 5 hours outside of Stockholm. Casey, our CEO, is in Amsterdam, and then I'm in our busy London headquarters by myself. So so we're spread out all over the place, and which we all met on the internet, and we all met talking about blockchain stuff over Skype, really, and doing projects and collaborative work with each other remotely. And so we've started out with that as the model because it doesn't make sense to move us all into one room. When the team is this big, you can do collaborative work, or rather, when the team is this small, collaborative work is fairly easy to accomplish.
So let's talk about this. So Eris Industries is. So I used to be a developer and sort of UX designer. I used to be quite involved with a lot of web projects, also as a project manager. And to me, this looks a lot like the same sort of software stack that we see in the, I guess, traditional world, only it's distributed.
Yeah.
I think you've described it as Node.js for the peer-to-peer technology. Can you sort of give us an overview of what Eris Industries is proposing?
I mean, so an Basically, what we're proposing is a software stack that uses a blockchain in a real-world context, because I think a lot of people in the decentralized computing space or distributed computing space, particularly blockchain, have tried to create a sort of mirror universe which is designed to replicate the functions of whatever institution or organization that they work with the real world without necessarily needing to interact with the real world at all. It's the idea, for example, that Bitcoin can replicate a banking system. Our hypothesis is somewhat different. It's that Bitcoin can't replicate a banking system because a banking system is dependent on legal relationships, legal constitution of assets, and human oversight making strategic decisions. So what we said is, what if, instead of trying to replicate the system entirely automatically, you use these tools which can automate data-driven relationships, plug them in to these organizations, have human administration to a degree, and realize efficiencies when you deploy these particular databases in economies of scale. So it's the difference between, with Bitcoin, attempting to do something where you're getting financial inclusion by having access to Bitcoin in a developing country. Instead, we would say, well, that kind of would look and feel like a credit union in let's say, Ghana or someplace like that. But if you actually had a real bank deploying one of these databases and doing it at very low cost, you would have an actual credit union in that country instead of something that just kind of looked and acted and mimicked. And the qualitative difference is significant because when you're dealing with something like Bitcoin, you're relying on the network effect, which monetizes the token in order to move value around. Whereas when you're dealing with something like a banking institution, you're looking at actual obligations, whether that be fiat or a debt obligation or something else, which are enforceable against someone, which have a real world and legal nexus. And that, from our perspective, is very important because most of mainstream finance deals in these kinds of abstractions. It deals in debts, it deals in obligations, it deals in rights. And these are not things you can pin down. They only really adopt an existence and a character when they are presented to a court for enforcement, and that's what makes people follow them. So on the one hand, we recognize that this is substantially at variance with the cryptocurrency model, which says that value is going to vest in a token because everybody wants it, and therefore you can use it for certain things. We say value vests in the obligation, and so it's kind of pulling cryptocurrency down to earth a little bit. But the blockchain data structure is something which you can use in order to transfer, record, and manage those obligations extremely efficiently. So, and that applies to all kinds of other things as well, whether you're looking at a purely utility task, like, for example, version control. Do you really need to decentralize completely version control? Or, if you just want a private GitHub repo, can you just set up a network with 5 nodes in your startup? And then each person in the startup will run a node, and then they'll have an extra hard drive, and you won't need to pay GitHub every month, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that we're not trying to recreate a new order that exists outside of everything that is. We're trying to create something that works in the way that the real world works, in the sense that you have applications, they have developers, those developers improve them and are responsible for their management and maintenance. Can we make developers' lives easier by putting in a blockchain database or any other kind of consensus database for that matter? And so that's the core hypothesis of the company.
So it's interesting that in Bitcoin it seems the notion is very, well, the notion is very central that it's about decentralization, right? And it's about disintermediating big players, big companies, etc. And this seems to be a completely different philosophy and interpretation of Bitcoin and the blockchain that's going on here, which is that it's just something that provides more efficiency. It lowers costs. It helps business, and then I guess in the way that lowering costs helps the third world, so developing countries. In that way, it benefits them, but it's not sort of through this revolutionary alternative system that we're building that will displace what we have.
Well, it depends on who you're disintermediating, right? So I think Bitcoin, we look at Bitcoin and we see the core innovation, not the currency, not anything political. We look at it and say, this is a clearing and settlement system, sort of merged into one, which is because there's no clearing, there's no central counterparty, so it's really just peer-to-peer settlement. And for that particular brand of settlement, it is really super efficient. But why is it efficient and why is it cheap? The answer is, but for the fact that you're having token generation and thus you need mining and other kinds of things to protect the chain. In terms of the pure settlement function, Bitcoin is, how to describe it? Bitcoin isn't disintermediating a bank. It's disintermediating the labor of a bank, the overheads of a bank, the costs of the bank. And so you have those costs arising somewhere else in the form of database management. So we said, okay, well, what happens if you take another clearing and settlement system, take any one you like, and then you script in the functionality that clearing and settlement system carries out. You put an administrator in charge. And then because you've set all of your input and output parameters in advance, you know what's coming in is going to give rise to a certain result with a very high degree of certainty. And then you say, well, if you're a bank, you want to disintermediate your costs. If you're someone who doesn't like banks, you want to disintermediate the bank.
Right.
So different users are going to have different requirements, and there will be different design parameters. But we think that for both the bank and the people who want to disintermediate them, each of them should have the option to set up their own system. And so what Eris, or rather what our blockchain designed, which is a very heavily modified derivative of Jeffrey Wilkes' Go client for the Ethereum protocol, what that's designed to do is give people the ability to select the parameters that they want for the application that they want. So if you want, you can go and do a Bitcoin clone, totally distributed, mining, whatever, SHA-256 proof of work, go for it, all yours. Or in the alternative, you can say, well, I'm running a clearing system or I'm running a government accounting system in a rural area in the middle of West Africa, and I want to keep track of where money is going to reduce corruption. Then I'll deploy this blockchain, and I'll know that anyone who has a particular balance, which they redeem through a gateway, which I lock down and trust very heavily, I'll make sure that there's no leakage and there's less. That's not my idea, by the way. That's Zachary Caceres of the Startup Cities Institute in Guatemala. He said, put a blockchain in a government, and then you won't have any leakage. You'll have the representations of value moving around, and you could even have someone in control. But if they're attempting to fiddle with that database, it's going to be very transparent when they do. So you could have a public government accounting database that works with the blockchain. You wouldn't want that to be fully decentralized. What you'd want it to do is rest in the hands of a particular entity and then have people watch it and see what they're doing with the funds that move in and out. So, yeah.
Well, I was going to say that the reality is that you don't actually need a totally decentralized system for all applications. That's the point. There's been the assumption that because of where Bitcoin comes from, and effectively most of the crypto revolution that's followed from Bitcoin, there's the assumption that total decentralization is valid in all cases, and the point is, I think, that it isn't necessarily valid in all cases, and you guys have come up with something which addresses that particular area that doesn't need total decentralization. You have a decentralized network, but you don't necessarily have decentralized administration. Is that
when I read about this,
right?
When I read about this, the impression that I get, or when I first read it, was that this is really just about using the technology that Bitcoin has brought on to create a way to have distributed web apps. Is that about
that's sort of the way that we've been describing it, because that, or at least initially, our first applications are going to be web apps. We're going to have a YouTube and an interactive marketplace. However, you can extend the analogy. If you can do a web app with it, you can do any other kind of data as well, which is kind of the point. If you can do YouTube, you can do a clearing system. If you can do YouTube, you can do data security and file storage. If you can do YouTube, you can do anything. And so, in effect, you can do DRM if you add a couple of other modules on top, for example, end-to-end encryption and messaging so that keys can get broadcast back and forth. So we're starting with the web apps, and that's as the proofs of concept. Because as a startup, we've only been incorporated for like 7 or 8 months. We've hustled our asses in that time. But you have to start somewhere, and you could go and say, right, well, we're going to design a clearing system. And isn't that great? And go up to Euroclear and say, hey guys, here's a clearing system. Or go up and say, hey guys, Citibank, here's something for your, here's something for your FX trading. And they'd go, great. go away. We have a perfectly good system, and we're not going to let a startup that's less than a year old start fiddling with our software stack. So for us, it was about demonstrating the wider utility, and it's an open source project. It's designed for people to use for their own applications. So for us, it's designed to we want to make something people can see, and then go, damn, I didn't know you could do that with a blockchain. That's really interesting. So that then they can take their own ideas, fork, hack, pull request, and off they go to the races, building stuff of their own, which is designed to utilize the distributed internet to scale their applications and challenge existing providers. I mean, why not do a distributed Uber for a particular locality? If you can script it and all profits go to charity, Uber has some PR problems. If someone wanted to build that and do something along those lines, and then create a challenger entity to Uber in a particular city by working with the state, and they could do it if they wanted to. The point is, we want to allow developers to exercise their utility and control, rather than sort of forcing them to build on top of other platforms. Other platforms, Bitcoin and Ethereum in particular, are going to be very useful going forward for this kind of stuff. Ethereum, we will know and love it, and we're sure it's going to be great. But for us, it's checkpointing and security and hashing things into a central chain which has a different trust profile. That will be useful for many applications. However, for running application logic, it's this distributed application where you have, it's free to the end user to use. And the cost is on the person deploying it in terms of making sure that they have the adequate server capacity or computing capacity. It doesn't necessarily need to be server capacity to roll that application and distribute the logic. So,
right, and I want to get into some of the more practical aspects of this. So there are different components to what you guys are proposing. There's a sort of server component, which I guess would also be the view component to like a web browser or an equivalent to a web browser. There's a blockchain. There's also some sort of a framework for generating contracts and a package manager. So we'll get to that in just a minute. Before we do that, I'd like to talk about our sponsor, Shapeshift. So Shapeshift, as many of you know, is the fastest and easiest way to buy and sell altcoins. If you want to buy altcoins today, I mean, before Shapeshift existed, really, it was quite cumbersome. You had to find a reputable exchange that supported the coin that you want to buy or sell. You've got to create an account, give them some personal information sometimes, and place an order, wait for the order to be fulfilled. It's just a long and cumbersome, and it's just like not very streamlined process. And then Shapeshift comes along and just makes all that completely useless. I mean, they're the best way to. I mean, why would you use an altcoin exchange now that you have Shapeshift that you could just buy and sell your coins instantly? So let's show you how this works. So when you go to shapeshift.io, you've got essentially what is Google Translate for cryptocurrencies, and on one side,
let's get some Doge.
Yeah, I'll send you a
Preston,
address.
do you have an address? If you're really quick, it can go to you.
No, it's all right. I don't actually have my wallet on this computer. This is.
I'll just send you.
Yeah. Okay.
All my serious stuff I leave at home. So. Included.
So on one side you have the currency you want to convert. The other side you have the currency you want to convert to. In this case, Doge. So let's Brian, put your address and put 1,000 Doge in the amount, or not.
So,
doesn't matter. And then you just send the bitcoins, or in this case bitcoins, but it could be Litecoin for Doge, it could be new bits for Peercoin, it could be whatever you want. We've been using simple examples here, but you can. The possibilities are endless. And then so you just need to scan that QR code, send the currency you want to convert to the address. Have you sent it?
Yeah, just send it now.
All right, so
pull up my and there it is.
There you go. So it's a waiting exchange. So they support Bitcoin, Litecoin, Peercoin, Darkcoin, Dogecoin, Namecoin, NXT, Feathercoin, Blackcoin, Bitcoin Dark, Quark, Redcoin, and new bits. So just like I'm not really good at doing math on top of my head, but think of all the possibilities there. You could do Darkcoin for Namecoin, NXT for Feathercoin, Blackcoin for Quark, or Bitcoin for Dogecoin. I mean, it's just amazing. And there you go. So in about 20 seconds, the order was fulfilled. I've received Dogecoin on my wallet. I don't know how many I've got there, but I'm sure I can send lots of Reddit tips.
1,655.
Awesome. Well, let's just hope for that Dogecoin price to go up, eh? Yeah, so great tool. It's the fastest and easiest way to buy and sell altcoins, and they only take a small fee, which is included in the price when you're sending your currency. So go to shapeshift.io, give it a try. Tell us what you think. We haven't gotten any feedback yet. We'd love to hear what you think about it, and we'd like to thank Shapeshift for their support of Epicenter Bitcoin.
And the reason everybody's been smiling is because Preston is a well-known supporter of Dogecoin in favor of any other coin.
It really is the future of money. I mean, I see a future. I see a future where walking through Kibera and you see the little smiley face, that little Shiba Inu staring back at you. I see that in my dreams. And so that I think is really the future.
No, I mean, I don't think any of us would disagree with Doge being the future of cryptocurrencies. So
coming back to Eris. So just to sort of introduce this topic, there are 4 components to Eris. And I think if you're a web developer and you read these white papers that you guys have put out on your website, you really get it. I mean, the D-server, for me, the D-server part was pretty straightforward when I first read it. It's the components which allows you to create web apps, web-style, data-driven, distributed apps, as you call them, and there's a browser component to that as well. So the question that always came to my mind when thinking about how are we going to create this decentralized internet was like, how do you integrate that into like a technology that we all know and use, which is open web technologies like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, if you don't have a browser, and you guys are solving that. Others are solving it too, admittedly, like Ethereum and like OpenBazaar, with Mist. So this is sort of a clever way to solve that problem, is to integrate a browser.
Yeah, I mean, so there in any blockchain implementation, or any blockchain application, there are 2 halves to the software. You have the protocol and the chain itself, and then you have the implementation in the client. So if you're dealing with something like Dogecoin, the future of money, and you'll have the blockchain and the protocol, which is distributed, and then you'll have the client, which is designed to match up to that protocol. If you want to make changes to the protocol, you have to change, substantial changes. You have to change the implementation in the client. What we did is we said, well, what Ethereum's done is they've got this very flexible and capable blockchain design. So if we have a distributed component, which is the blockchain, and then we move a lot of those consensus parameters into a VM, which is on the client side, and we structure it in such a way that what the blockchain is telling that particular VM to display through a web browser displayed at localhost is something which looks like a web page, then you've got an application that looks like a web page. Now, the way that we've done that is through something which is called the D server. So if you imagine the blockchain is the database backend, the D server displays all of the information and then allows a felonious blockchain to go talk to other protocols. So what it does, we started out and we have a Bitcoin module, an Ethereum POC7 module, and an IPFS module. So you can currently write a dApp on a felonious chain which talks to Bitcoin and talks to Ethereum and talks to IPFS. So
and this happens through the D server, is that right?
This happens through the D server, correct. So the technical details, I'm more on legal structuring than the actual technical stuff, but we can always get Casey or Ethan or one of the guys to talk about this sort of deep dive on a later date. But what the D server allows you to do is to talk to multiple protocols in the context of a single app. So if you've got a distributed YouTube, and the distributed YouTube we're building, for example, has a Bitcoin content incentivization function. So a user will have a Bitcoin key pair which they upload into their particular client program. They'll have, the IPFS will store all of the data. Felonious will tell them what they're able to see. There will be magnet links, for example, to BitTorrent is one thing we used with Eris 0.1. And all of that then displays in a consistent application. And when the user sends a command to Felonious and says, well, I want to watch this video, if they're not allowed to do it as as put by the poster of the video, then they're not going to see it. If they don't have access to that information, then the information is not going to display on their screen. So much in the same way, it requires more design work, Thelonious, than other blockchains. It's not something which you just roll and then all of a sudden it's designed to solve a problem. It's a framework for you to put scripts in and put functionality in, which you then will know will only execute on the provision of the relevant private key by the relevant user who you've authorized to access that information or write on the database in respect of the particular function that that contract governs. So the key, go for it.
Yeah, just a brief question. So, with this YouTube example, right? You mentioned Ethereum, and this is a sort of a fork of Ethereum, you could say. When would you?
We don't like to use the word, but yeah.
Yeah. So, what's the advantage of doing something like this decentralized YouTube on top of Ethereum versus what you guys are doing, or where's the balance here, or the trade-off?
The trade-off is a cost trade-off. So if you do something on Ethereum, so our original Eris dApp cost 250,000 gas just to deploy, and the other problem was the thing was huge, so you might not be able to get it onto a single block. The way that we've structured Thelonious is that most of the dApp logic goes into the Genesis block, and then it's up to the developer to decide what parameters they want to set in terms of monetization.
So if I can, let's sort of rephrase that, or like interpret how I see that, right? So the reason why it would be hugely expensive with Ethereum is because you have the security of the entire Ethereum network. I mean, okay, it doesn't exist yet, but you will, of the future Ethereum network, securing that application. But in some cases, that makes no sense, right? If this YouTube is run by a company that you sort of trust anyway, then the idea is that you can do something with a different security model, different consensus model that's much, much cheaper, but it has a similar architecture. Is that correct?
More or less. I mean, one example I use is if you're looking at a financial platform, so let's look at an Ethereum-based financial platform versus a bank-deployed financial platform. An Ethereum-based financial platform has to contend with every user of the system being mutually untrustworthy. A bank-deployed system, however, can be designed so that you can have administrative control. I mean, you can secure these chains without mining.
But couldn't you do this in an Ethereum contract as well?
You could, but it would cost money. So what you do it would cost money to run all of the computation. Yeah. So with a Thelonious chain, you can structure it. Our default gas price is 0. And the reason you can get away with that is because you simply just say in the Genesis block, well, the only people who are able to write to this database are people who the administrator has pre-authorized. So if you're a bank and you're running a bank platform, when someone attempts to make an API call to a contract on your blockchain, and they haven't got they either haven't got a key pair or they're trying to spam it with some other sort of things, the contract is just going to bounce off because it'll say, well, you don't have the permissions to write, so go to hell. The idea is that when you have an application which is controlled by an entity, yes, you have an attack vector, which in the form of the private keys which control the chain. However, you're deploying a blockchain which is designed to protect your users from the rest of the world, but not you, instead of a blockchain which is designed to protect everyone, including you, from everybody else. And in most commercial contexts, that's not what is required. I mean, if trust were that big of a problem in everyday life, then we would be seeing blockchains everywhere. Bitcoin would have solved, the commercial problem. And in fact, frankly, the opposite is true. In most commercial relations, you need to have third parties involved in order to make certain discretionary assessments as to whether facts have occurred or what the meaning of a provision was, or even to constitute an asset itself. So instead, this isn't a technical detail, oh, well, we have someone administering it. When you have someone administering something, you suddenly have accountability. You have a legal nexus, which allows you to deal in legal obligations. And that's something which Bitcoin doesn't have. So you're dealing with a distributed ledger, but a distributed ledger does not have agency, and it doesn't have legal personality. So it's going to be very hard to actually structure in legal obligations on a distributed ledger where something that's broken cannot be fixed, or cannot be unwound, or cannot be undone. And so people say, well, maybe we don't want them undone, but the fact is, in mainstream finance, undoing transactions and amending transactions quite without the consent of the parties involved in some cases is something which happens all the time. So we've structured this blockchain system from a financial perspective to deal with those considerations. And it was something we looked at the distributed, when I was a lawyer, this is a problem I identified. How can you work with a system that you can't fix in the event of a misrepresentation or a fraud or a simple mistake. No one is going to use that system. If you have one system, and this is a simple question of competition. If you have a system which protects your rights and is slightly expensive, and one that doesn't protect your rights and is free of charge or has a different cost structure, the rights themselves are very valuable, and I suspect most people will go for the system that structures in their rights. That's my own particular view on that.
Okay. I recently saw a tweet by Peter Todd, and it said something like that. So the only advantage of Bitcoin, and I think he talked about cryptocurrencies as sort of as a class, is decentralization. Now it seems here that you're sort of taking the blockchain side, but then getting rid to decentralization, I guess to varying degrees, right? In some cases maybe not at all, but in other cases completely. How does that make sense?
Because you can spread your data out without necessarily having to have it. Redundancy is built in and security is built in. So blockchain security can be achieved in several dozen lines of code. What would require servers and IT administrators, I mean, this is what Bitcoin has proven. You can deploy a database which secures itself very, very simply and very elegantly in very few lines of code. So whereas currently we require oversight and administrators to do that. So by relying on mathematics instead of people and oversight, you're reducing a cost. Additionally, the data itself, fault tolerance is very, very high. If you're running 100 nodes, one example I use, let's say you're an international bank, right? I always refer to banking, I apologize. Let's say you're some kind of organization and you run a blockchain or a series of blockchains to administer your functions. And one of your offices, suddenly out of nowhere, an asteroid falls out of a clear blue sky and wipes your New York headquarters off the map. Well, if you're running nodes in 10 other countries that have redundant copies of the same data, then, let's say it happens at night, so all your people are at home. The following day, they just walk in, download a software program, plug in their private key, and they're up and running, just as, completely uninterrupted, because that data store has continued to administer itself without, it's continued to administer itself by virtue of the way that it's structured. So redundancy and fault tolerance is extremely high. That's valuable. Currently, these companies need to use data centers offshore, 3, 4, 5 of them per corporate, very expensive to administer. And that's a cost, and it's a very significant cost. So from our perspective, if you can just build that into a system and have it run quietly and automatically in the background, that's a substantial advantage that these systems will have over existing data structures.
And now here's a thought that makes it difficult for the purists. Here's a product, by the sound of it, that is going to be very attractive to existing mainstream banks to implement blockchain technology to do some of the work that they currently do more cost effectively, potentially reducing the cost for those customers. If that happens, we're likely to see a greater mass adoption of crypto indirectly than directly. So we're going to see people using the blockchain even though they don't realize they're using the blockchain. Perhaps they don't feel the confidence to use the blockchain or to use crypto technology right now. They don't trust the trustlessness of it, but indirectly they may end up, many more people may be using the blockchain than would otherwise have been the case if they have the direct option of participating in directly in Bitcoin and other currencies. Interesting thought. Mass adoption by the back door.
That's exactly the point. I mean, another reason we're going with web apps is to show that you can use a blockchain without knowing you're using it. Because if you have to know you're using it, I'm not that computer literate. If I had to go in and run everything from the command line in order to use it, I probably wouldn't, as would 99% of the population. So the idea is that you have a data structure which brings all of these principles into a mainstream application without anyone needing to have the technical capacity to do so. So I mean, there's a guy named Jawad Yaqub who's developed a distributed desktop which has some blockchain components called DIOS, and his thesis is, you have a desktop which uses the blockchain to secure certain functions, and people see a desktop. And it's the same thing with Eris. People have an interactive application, and they see an interactive application. They do not see the blockchain that runs in the background. To Ethereum's great credit, none of this really would have been possible without certain of the structures, particularly the Patricia Merkle tree, which they innovated as part of their open source project. So this is where we see the space is going, and entirely because of the open source model. Is according, and following that, we've open sourced all of our stuff as well. So
assuming, oh, Sebastian, did you?
Well, go ahead, finish your thought. I just want to come back to the browser for a second.
So assuming this finds it works out, there's a lot of developers start using it, developing applications like that. What would the impact of that be? Like, how would that change the way people interact with applications? And in particular, also from a sort of business model perspective, do you think that will change the way maybe monetization works as well?
I think that yes. I mean, in terms of how the structure of the internet might change if this technology were widely used, is that you would have users voluntarily. Users would not necessarily use an application because it was convenient. They would also use it for other things, like this particular developer respects my privacy. And there would be transparency as to what a developer could do with user data. So if you had a series of distributed social networks or Twitters or Reddits or God knows what else, and a developer said, well, this is incentivized to do this, and we're not going to shove advertising in your face. That's something which I think people would find valuable, and they may migrate over to those systems, and as a result of which, it would be an order of magnitude harder for corporates to sell that data or do any meaningful sales of that data, and also for governments to observe that data without authorization or user consent. But and it would be transparent if the application changed over time. How the developer was actually, what the developer was doing.
So the difference here, right? Because today someone could go and start an alternative social network and say we're not going to do any advertising, and of course people have done that, right? But so the difference here would be that it would be visible for everyone in the blockchain what they actually are able to do.
I mean, consent would become more transparent. I mean, if you structure a blockchain so that people can't see your data, and that at a later date they would not be able to change it as to make that data readable, then yeah, you would have an application where you cannot reverse that kind of consent, and so that potentially that could disrupt a lot of business models in that you don't need advertising anymore to run an application. Your users use it simply because of the convenience. And let's say when you're opening the window, anytime the window's open, you start processing transactions. That's something where I think it'll have a very substantial impact. But in another sense, one thing, version control in GitHub. I think I may have mentioned this earlier, so apologies if I'm repeating myself. But we run a startup, and we have to pay all manner of service providers, third-party service providers, for the things we use. One of those is a private GitHub repo. If you can script version control, and we are working on that, and then have a distributed GitHub DApp that you and your company run, all of a sudden that cost falls away. So you're dealing with protocols governing the way that people interact instead of servers, which everybody's always querying, which hold all their data off-site and frankly expose you to those servers. So people will have a lot more control over the risks to which they're exposed because they're going to be able to move those risks in-house and then distribute them in such a way that they're able to mitigate them to a significant extent. So there will be other considerations. Private key management is going to be a very big one. But we think that that's the direction things are going. In terms of the business model, it's a free software model where services, we think that there's going to be a very big market for these services going forward, distributed database management. And so we would like to be the provider of those services. Yeah, because that's how business works. So we can't patent this stuff anyway because of prior art and because no one would frankly use it because it has to be open source if it's going to be secure. Another Peter Todd line, nothing that isn't secure isn't open source, or everything that is secure is, rather. So because people are able to assess it, test it, take pot shots at it, and use it for whatever purpose they want, and for us that's really important. So yeah, it's a free software model. We think that skilled labor in this space is very, very thin on the ground, and we would like to be the skilled labor that helps to bring blockchains into wider use.
So I'd like to come back to the browser for a second. So I think that the browser is an important component to sort of user adoption and consumer adoption and bring just regular people on. But there is sort of a problem with that as more and more of these blockchain technologies start issuing browsers, is that you have this you have multiple browsers that aren't necessarily compatible with each other, and which require users to have multiple browsers installed on their systems if they want to be able to do anything. And if we look back in history, this does resemble a little bit, the early internet in the early 90s, where you had AOL and Netscape, and each had their own protocol implementations, and each had their own websites, and each had their own even like HTML implementation standard. How do you think this will evolve? How will we overcome this? Can we expect like browsers like Google Chrome and Firefox to start implementing these protocols, or are we waiting for a new generation of browsers to emerge from this?
I mean, really, what we've built, we use Chromium for the D server. So it actually it's a Google Chrome browser that works best with it, and so our approach is that you can take a module wrapper for any of the other protocols, plug it into the D server, and then your standard Google Chrome web browser will be able to display whatever that module wrapper has been written for, and you just access it through the VM at localhost. So it's not like we built our own browser from scratch. We use Chrome, normal ordinary web browser, but the D server, right, which is sitting behind it, allows that normal web browser to go talk to all of those other protocols. So the D server is displaying the DApp through Chrome or another web browser, and then the D server is what sits underneath it. So it can talk to Ethereum, Bitcoin, I mean, we're really big on cross-platform interoperability, and so.
But your browser you have to have had implemented those protocols in order for your browser to be compatible with it.
You have to have written the module wrapper for the D server,
right,
in order, and then have a DApp, so the application will need to be able to talk to all of the various APIs for the different protocols. And if that happens, then you can put them through a regular web browser. So we haven't built, the D server is the web browser, but it's only in the sense that it displays through a normal web browser. It's not a standalone browser. So yes, it's possible that Google or Firefox or someone else could create a D server button, and then you could have your D server button, which allows you to go and do various other things. At the moment, you don't even need to do that. You just go localhost 3000, and hey presto, your DApps, you get your D server administrator screen, and then your DApps are in a little box on the side. So that for us is, we didn't have to reinvent the wheel, and it can talk to all of these other protocols just through stuff that most people already have on their computer.
Okay. Well, it seems to me like probably the next logical step is to create some sort of a standard protocol. I mean, I don't know what the equivalent would be in the traditional web world, but a standard protocol that every browser manufacturer would implement, and which would be able to talk to just about any protocol.
I mean, we've talked to all the protocols are different, so you can't have a standard protocol for protocols. I mean, or you could, but I think that would involve a lot of developer teams saying, well, giving up on their visions of the way things should work. And so the D server is designed to let them, in the way that they think their protocol should be structured, then create something which allows the D server to talk to their protocol as they envision it and as they wish it to be. I don't think that moving to a standard, just in the same way that we don't have a standard cryptocurrency, we're not going to have a standard DApp, but we have to have a way that those DApps can communicate with each other in a uniform way. And so the important thing, Thelonious is a protocol design. It is not a protocol itself. It can be changed by the developers if they choose. They can set any consensus parameters they want. We're hoping to have variety in the kind of opcodes that are available in the VM. This is something where we want it to be as open as possible, so that, but it requires work. You need to actually do the work, write the module wrapper, and then write the DApp, which is designed to plug one protocol, counterparty into Ethereum or Bitcoin into Dogecoin. So we don't want to tell people how their protocols are supposed to look. We want to give them a way that they can plug their protocols into other things and develop applications which are free to use, which leverage the utility of all of these separate protocols. And this includes BitTorrent, IPFS, distributed file stores as well.
So Preston, one of the things, and I think this also partially comes from your background as a lawyer, that you guys have seemed to emphasize a lot is the legal side, right? So integrating the legal system. So first of all, what's your view currently of the decentralized app space from sort of legal standpoint, and how do you think decentralized apps would be implemented? Or let's put it, so yeah, first of all, what's your view of the decentralized app space from a legal perspective, and second of all, the crowdfunding aspect and having its own token is like very central to decentralized apps. So would that sort of thing also be built on top of Eris?
I think we'll start with the second question before we go to the first, because it's a simpler answer. Personally, and we have different opinions on this in Eris Industries, I'm personally not legally comfortable with the crowdfunding model for a lot of the reasons that there's very few critics of that model have, in that you're selling what is effectively, you're selling something to people who are not sophisticated investors in a very high-risk environment, and quite irrespective of the legal niceties of that approach, I don't think it's a wise approach. So it remains to be seen what will happen to startups that have followed that model. But I think that the more appropriate way to do it is to have an app which is free to your users, where you secure private funding that knows the risk they're getting involved in. From a legal perspective, more generally, I think a lot of the space is looking at a legal problem, which is asset transfer, because assets only have existence in the eyes of the law. There are legal concepts which depend on how they were created and how they came into the hands of the person who is then trading them. So, and this is especially true in finance. And I think that a lot of engineering solutions have been proposed which rely on the base premise that you have a token of some kind which is of non-zero value, for example, Bitcoin. And then what you do is you can replicate the economic substance of one of these transactions while disintermediating a third-party provider. The fact is, there's a risk to that, which is that any user who does that, so let's say on the one hand you have dollars and on the other hand you have gold, and you set up all of this computing architecture around it and then put a token in the middle which is designed to replicate these assets and then mediate the trade with some price feeds and God knows what else. You are actually exposed to movements in all three of the prices, whereas if you simply have a bilateral peer-to-peer trade in the real asset itself, then you're only exposed to the movements in the one, or over the life of the transaction if it's something like a derivative movements in two. So it's using something which is actually very easily circumvented by simply having an enforceable claim, which requires the possibility of enforcement, which requires a third-party administrator of the database in question in order to give effect to that enforcement. So this isn't a technical thing. It's not a computing problem that can be solved. It's a legal structuring issue. And if you're going to structure it correctly, you have to have the third party who can step in and amend that transaction on the provision of a court order. So that's why we took that approach. It's not something where we're like, yeah, we think decentralization is this and decentralization is that. It's a simple legal technical issue, which is that if you're going to have an asset, you need to have some kind of enforcement mechanism to deal with the full complexity of what that asset represents. A token is maybe a representation of something, but in most cases, let's say you're dealing with a debt obligation, you want to move that around in a blockchain. Debt obligations are hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of paper worth of representations and obligations. They're tremendously complex. The placement of a comma or a or the, one word in the wrong place, can change the way you interpret very significant parts of that obligation. And you have there are two options. Either you try to script it all, which no one has yet done, and I think would be not worth the effort, or you simply script the payment mechanics, use the blockchain as the mechanism which renders that transaction more efficient from a cost perspective, and then you incorporate all of the legal control that you need by having a third-party administrator who sits outside of the transaction but has the ability to amend the database. So this is why we took that approach. It's a simple question of how things currently work.
It's how it works and how it fits within a current legal framework. So if you want to take advantage of being able to enforce your rights, then you need to operate a system that works within the current legal system. And clearly what you've come up with here makes that possible. If you don't care about that and you just want to trust the trustless world, then you don't need what you've come up with. You can do it by one of the existing methods. And really the decision here is do you want to take advantage of the legal system if things go wrong? I think that's what it boils down to.
I mean, there's some things like Mike Hearn's Lighthouse, that's perfect for decentralization. You can see the code, you can inspect it, you know that if that particular, crowd fund, and that's not a crowd sale, that's a crowd fund where it's by donation. If that particular project or improvement on the Bitcoin core protocol, if it crosses a certain threshold, the funds will move. And that's okay, because for that kind of a transaction, you're dealing with a very simple, straight, absolute disposal. If you're dealing with something where obligations start going multiple directions, and you have 12, 15, 100 parties to a transaction, however many, and each set of obligations between them may be materially different, then you have something which is so complex that if you want to code it, you can, but I don't see why you'd want to. So it's, it would just, these transactions quite apart from having to translate all this stuff into code, negotiating one of these deals can take a year or 2 years. So you can imagine what creating a coded framework for them would take in terms of labor power. And you're talking about teams of people, 10 lawyers per transaction party and 10 transaction parties per transaction. This is very complex stuff. So the way that you simply deal with that is by leaving the law pretty much as it is, incorporating the law into the transaction, and then using the blockchain as the mechanism which carries out payment mechanics and other things which are very, and title even, is very easy to quantify. In England, we have a title database which is a central database of title. It's not going to be hard to reduce all of those categories to particular number. Every title has a number. So people who say, well, we've got to quantify title, this has actually already been done in a centralized context. The question for us is how do we use a distributed data store to make that process more efficient and more effective? And it extends to other types of functions. Querying health records, that perfect application where you would want to have a database that anyone can access, but you want a very simple security logic so that only certain people can access certain records. I mean, a blockchain is perfect for that, tied in with end-to-end encryption and a distributed data store. Multiple, redundant, automatic, requires no oversight, like, great, super, go for it. And so it's that kind of economy where you're going to see a blockchain being very effective. So from our perspective, that's how we look at it.
Well, if you want to learn more about Eris Industries and what you guys are doing, you can go to erisindustries.com. And what I really like about what you've done is you've actually set up separate domain names for all the components. So it's really easy for a developer to come in and read the white paper. And actually, there's tutorials, documentation. So I mean,
blog posts too.
Yeah, and very interesting blog posts as well. I'm actually gonna. I mean, I've got some development skills, so I may look into this and maybe try to write something.
Casey is gonna love what you just said, because we had a substantial discussion in the 24 hours up to launch. How many brands are we launching, Casey? No, Preston, it makes sense. This is how developers think.
No, but I love this. I love how you've done this, and I think it's really clear. And especially what's really important is like the tutorials, right? Like copy this line into your terminal, and so yeah, that's really great. Just before we wrap up, there's one article that you wrote. So Eris Industries has a blog called Doing Business Distributed, or Doing Distributed Business rather, and you wrote an article called "Blockchain Your Business in Just 7 Steps," which is sort of like you've got a traditional business. Let's turn it into a blockchain business. Here are the 7 steps you need to go through. Could you just kind of walk us through those real quick?
Yeah, so I mean, basically, this blog post is designed to get people, being a business, we have to get people thinking the way we do. So this was designed to do that. I'm attempting to brainwash everybody on this Hangout into thinking about the world the way I do. But basically, the overarching theme is that blockchain isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. Bitcoin itself is not a one-size-fits-all solution to your problems. So blockchain's a database. Smart contracts, or rather, adapt as an application, an interactive application. And if you want to make use of these things, you have to adopt a developer culture. And you need to start thinking about how you design interactive applications using these databases. So step 1 is reassess the landscape. And that basically is what we've been discussing on legal obligations and thinking in terms of distributed rather than fully decentralized. Step 2, redefining the problem. Again, Thelonious, which is our blockchain design, can do some pretty interesting stuff. One of those things is you can secure it without mining, which means it's very inexpensive to secure. And the other thing is that you can control it, so you're not exposed to regulatory or operational risk. And in addition to that, you can amend the application over time. It can change its parameters without a hard fork. And getting that into people's heads, they go, really? What? You can do that? Yes, you can. Smart contracts allow it. So if you assume that you can amend an application, you can control an application, you can secure it very cheaply, then start thinking about the other kinds of things you can do now that you've got one of these databases in your hands. Putting the user first, this is really about making sure that the users have a consistent and free-to-use internet interactive experience. We haven't built a cryptocurrency. The internet, as it works today, all of Google Hangouts, what we're using right now, is free to us, and it costs money for Google. So, in order for applications to be economically viable, they will have to continue to be free, and that's what Eris allows. There is some cost somewhere because a blockchain isn't a perpetual motion machine, but that cost will be borne by the developer, and ideally it will be much lower than those costs are currently. Step 4, we've open sourced it. It's free software. Fork, hack, do whatever you want. That's the way it should be. 5, this is really as a result of feedback with financial institutions and other corporates, in that they're not resourcing their development arms enough. They've got developed to actually go and develop and do some interesting stuff. But in order to really leverage this technology, people say, so what can you give us, Eris? And we say, well, we can give you a database. And they go, great, so what will it do? And you go, well, that's something which you as an organization need to decide. It's up to you to figure out where your pain points are. We don't know them, you do. And then get your developers on this and actually have your developers solve those pain points with an automatic database. So, people aren't thinking of it in those terms, but now that they have a blockchain they can control, that's really how they need to start thinking. Step 6, join the open source movement and save the world. That's that's the point where earlier we were saying, the difference between a Bitcoin credit union in a developing country and an actual credit union in a developing country. A legal obligation can be transferred over a blockchain, and if you can get inexpensive market infrastructure into places that don't have it, then what you're doing is you're using the blockchain. You're not relying on tokens in order to do it. There is a cost. That cost will be lower. And finally, dive on in. The water's great. That's pretty self-explanatory. We have a Skype channel where we're Eris Industries on Freenode. We've got a subreddit, our Eris Industries, and it's an open source project, and the more the merrier as far as we're concerned. This is something.
Does this list? These steps, do they follow David Johnston's DApp framework?
Do they? I haven't read it.
Oh
no, they definitely should.
It is a definitive framework for building dApps. Perhaps there are some amendments that need to be done to this.
I think this, yeah. No, it's definitely a different model, right? Because the David Johnston DApp model, the whole tokenization is super key, and he says like, so I think it's a very different model, but this is very interesting, and I think. So we will put a link to this article also in the show notes, and I am very excited to see kind of the first project, because it's and hopefully people actually developing applications on this soon, and if we actually particularly if we will see applications running on Eris, we'll see applications running on Ethereum soon. I think that would be fantastic to see, and I hope you guys will be successful with that.
We're really interested to see the Eris Ethereum connection. There's no denying it, and we're really interested to see how an Eris DApp and an Ethereum DApp, or rather Ethereum, the protocol, are going to work together, and what kind of added security, in particular, that can provide for an Eris DApp that's used for something. So it is going to be interesting to see. It's very early days. We've only been around for 2.5 weeks, but it should be a really exciting year, and we're really looking forward to working with everyone from the various distributed protocols on how we can make dApps that make their protocols more valuable and more useful.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're interested in that, please check out the website, get in touch with them. And so thanks so much for joining us today. Also, Sean, thank you for joining us today. Giving us an update. We didn't have so much time to talk. You didn't have so much time to talk, but I'm sure we'll have you back on. Maybe when this bit of license thing is out, or definitely when the sort of definite version of the bit of license thing is out, we'll definitely have to do a full episode on that.
Look forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks so much for joining us. So next week coming up, we're gonna have Tim Swanson on to talk about. I don't know. He sent us like a list of 40 things we could talk about. We're gonna have to dive through and figure out. We're gonna have to figure out which ones we should cover. But I think it will be a great episode, and we've been wanting to have him on for a while. So if you like the show, please help us out. Leave us an iTunes review. That helps new people find the show. If you watch this by video, subscribe to us on YouTube, and then you will also get
coming
updates.
up on 300 subscribers.
Yeah, you will updates for the live episodes as well. And of course, you can always give us a donation either on epicenterbitcoin.com/tips, or just do it in YouTube if you're watching there. So thanks so much, and we look forward to being back next week.
Thanks, guys.